Hi, I'm Mike Schuster.
And I'm Gary Mason, and this is Aftermath of Murder,
The series.
We'd like you to note that for legal reasons, full names will not be used, and all interviews have been edited for brevity and content.
Welcome to the podcast. Just to give you a little recap of our story thus far.
Ted Price has been brutally murdered, execution style, in the middle of the Arizona desert. He was brought out there by two people, a man named Aaron Gunches and a woman named Jennifer.
Jennifer made a confession to the police in exchange for a lighter sentence, and she was taken into custody.
Stopped for a routine traffic stop by police, Gunches panics, shoots a DPS officer twice, and flees. He was then apprehended and was being held in a nearby county.
Ultimately, the officer lived, and Gunches was charged with an attempted murder in that incident.
But after Jennifer's confession, Gunches was brought to Maricopa County to answer for the charges of kidnapping and murder in the death of Ted Price.
Charges he pleaded guilty to. And after years of appeals and sitting on death row, Gunches finally requests that the Attorney General file a warrant of execution for his own death.
Basically, he's saying to the state that he just wants to get the execution over with.
But he gives a rather questionable explanation for the warrant.
And here, we're caught up in our story.
Gunches tells the courts that he wants the warrant of execution, quote, so that justice may lawfully be served and give closure to the victim's family.
Right. This is a weird twist of conscience for this guy.
It is odd. He states he's doing this to give the victim's family closure. Few murderers ask to be put to death for the sake of the victim's family.
And this is a new circumstance that meets with an enthusiastic reaction from Ted's family. When the Supreme Court actually issued the warrant, how did that make you feel?
Like it was going to be over, finally.
Yeah.
So it's funny because your first instinct is justice is going to be served. He's going to get exactly what he deserves. The fact that he's asking to be put to death makes you realize that he's not super happy being there. So then there's a part of you that's like, well, wait a minute. Maybe I don't want him to be executed. Maybe I'll just be happy with him staying in jail for a long time. Justin and Brittany, Ted's kids, they actually both felt that way at first as well, that, well, if he's asking to be executed, I don't want him to be executed. I want him to stay in prison. Now, if he wants to stay in prison, then I want him to be executed, just because you don't want him to get what he wants, right? You want it to be the opposite. But it didn't take very long for me to get over my desires for him to suffer and be unhappy for a lot more years in prison, because I realized that if they executed him, I wouldn't have to think about him anymore.
And here's Ted's daughter, Brittany.
I feel like everybody has their own ways of dealing with closure. Some people forgive, the other person. That is not me. I will not do that. I think it's possible. You just have to kind of come to your own kind of understanding of where you want to stay at that keeps you comfortable with just knowing that you're fine. Obviously, it's not fine, and, we go on every day like it's the next, but just morally knowing that the person that took his life is no longer living and has gotten his punishment would technically make me feel a lot better.
Right. So you'd say that his execution would either lead to or help lead to closure for you.
Absolutely. I didn't like the fact that he requested it. I didn't like the fact that he asked for it and he wants it. But, he was given the death sentence, and whether he asked for it or not, I have to deal with this until it's seen through. And so for them to give an actual date, it was like, massive like relief of we are this much closer for it to be done and over.
So, at this point in the story, January of 2023, Gary and myself attempt to contact Gunchus in prison and see what he has to say for himself.
Believe it or not, beyond snail mail letters, you can actually email inmates in prison these days.
Well, so we informed him that we're undertaking a documentary project about this case and that we're curious if he'd like to speak with us. He says that he didn't file the motion to give closure to the family, really, but that he merely wrote that on the execution request to make it look good. He says that he did it to give closure really to himself.
Right. And he goes on to say that he pled guilty, but it's not because he was guilty.
He says that he has no interest in taking part in our project, but he does wish that Ted's family would have gotten more involved and tried to find out what really happened and not think he was all responsible for it.
Right. And there is one thing that Gunchus says in his correspondence with us that we found compelling.
He says, and I quote, "I'm not happy with Kat or Lily, especially after I realized what they did and how it was put on me."
Now, not that we want to call anybody names, but we do know that he's a lying murderer sitting on death row, right?
What can you believe, right?
Right. And we also know that Jennifer, a.k.a. Lily, she's already done her time. What about Catherine, Ted's ex-girlfriend?
Yeah. Lily was committed to 17 years.
17 years, right.
But served 14?
No, well, she served all 17 of them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I should be watching this podcast more carefully.
You should be. What about Catherine, Ted's ex-girlfriend?
Yeah. We have discussed Kat's possible role in the murder on the podcast before, but, I think Gunchus's remark warrants further discussion.
Right. The night of Ted's murder, she, Kat, and Ted got into an argument, and she hit him in the face with a telephone because she's a real sweetheart.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not disputed, right? She even admitted that to the police.
Yeah, but it was after that she and Wesley left the apartment, leaving Ted there bleeding and incoherent with the roommate, Michelle. And soon after, who shows up but Aaron Gunchus?
Yeah. I don't think it's a huge assumption that Kat called Gunchus, and he came over at her behest.
Yeah. I think the main thing to ask is, what did she actually say to him? What were her intentions, and what did she ask Gunchus to specifically do?
Right. I mean, she has to have been involved, in my mind.
Yeah, and she's been very careful, and we've discussed this before, not to say anything against Gunchus. Gunchus never said anything in court against her, although there's all these innuendos when we've talked to him that he's not happy about her involvement,
putting this on him,
and
right.
Not protecting herself. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Well, anyways, here's Ted's daughter, Brittany.
It just pisses me off now because I feel like she's the reason why he's not here. She's the only common denominator of what happened, and for there not to be enough to pin her down for some of this, it just blows my mind. And I feel like it's only mainly because of all the things I've learned this past year with us fighting for him to get executed. I didn't know that it took 10 months for him to be arrested and for him to visit him in jail, and her lying to my grandmother that, Ted was on a bus, and obviously she knew that didn't happen. So I don't know. Emotionally, it's all over the place. I would hope that she wasn't like, hey, go take care of him. I would really hope that that was not purposely said. But for her to have someone just be like, yeah, take him somewhere, but then not know what happened, I don't believe she didn't know. There is no way she did not know. So I feel like her playing the naive, no, I didn't know. There's no way. In 10 months of him not being arrested and them communicating, there's no way she didn't know what happened. So I don't want to, I would really hope that she wasn't, like, the words came out of her mouth like, hey, like, you need to take care of him. I would really hope that was not the case.
And if Jennifer's account of that night is fairly accurate, it seems like Gunches spoke to Kat on the phone multiple times throughout the night.
We should note that Catherine has had some troubles with the law after Ted's murder, but none of them involved any charges of conspiracy or anything like that involving Ted's case.
Interestingly, they involved the very thing Ted was concerned about that got him killed, right? It was the way she was caring for her children.
You know, there's a telephone call between Michelle when Michelle was in prison. Michelle made this call to Kat under the guise of just friendship, but was being recorded from the prison.
Oh, that's right.
And
that's in the police reports, by the way, that you can have access to if you come to the website and become a member.
Yeah. And in that, she's cagey. And I'm talking about Kat. She just, Michelle's trying to draw out, you know, what other people have said and so forth. And she's saying basically, and I'll clean up her language, basically she was saying they didn't say anything. Stick to the story, stick to the story. Never, in this conversation with her, Kat brings up the fact, you know, I bet this is being recorded, you know, there's clicks or something. But even before that, she's very careful not to indict herself. So anyway.
Well, I think it's interesting that the police do that because I think they believe Kat has something to do with Ted's murder.
Yeah.
And they're trying to get some sort of evidence they can use to hold her accountable.
Well, you know, it's interesting. She did get caught in lies.
Right.
About what happened that evening.
Right.
And she was never brought to task on that.
Anyways, we did manage to find Kat, and she's no longer living in Arizona.
We asked her if she would interview for us and for this project, and she turned us down flatly.
Of course she did.
Yeah.
Now, at this point in our story, Ted's family teams up with a victim's rights attorney, Colleen Clace. Here she is discussing the situation.
Inmate Gunches last year on his own filed a pro per motion seeking a warrant of his own execution. Procedurally, I'm not sure that that's been done before. Shortly after he filed that motion for warrant, Attorney General Mark Brnovic's office filed a motion for warrant of execution. And that's generally how the process gets started once a death row inmate's appellate remedies have been exhausted.
It's interesting that Gunches requested his warrant of execution be issued in November, which is an election year. And the governor was up for re-election. It's interesting that there are two candidates. One is a liberal, Katie Hobbs, and the other is a very, very conservative, Carrie Lake. And when the new governor takes over, she'll appoint a new attorney general.
And who won?
Well, Katie Hobbs won.
Yeah, so a little bit more liberal than a very conservative.
A little bit, yeah. And she'll take office in January. So the outgoing attorney general does request a warrant of execution from the Supreme Court, and he obtains that warrant of execution for Aaron Gunches. And now that execution must be carried out within 35 days.
The question is, will it happen?
Join us next week and see if you can find out on Aftermath of Murder.
The series.
I'm Gary Mason.
I'm Mike Schuster.
This has been Aftermath of Murder.
The series.
Please join us next week for episode 8.
Closure. Although I have pushed some of these drugs, but not in a lethal manner.
Acting on behalf of Ted's family, sues the state of Arizona to execute Gunches. Be sure to check out our webpage at aftermathofmurderseries.com for more information, access to special content, merchandise, and more.
Our writer is Darren Coyle. This has been a Closure AOM production in association with KM Voice.